Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're literally grabbing our hard hats and looking at the architectural plans of an entire nation's workforce. We are tracking a really fascinating visual timeline, the 120-year evolution of technical and vocational education and training, or TVET, in Malaysia. Think of this whole thing like a massive engineering project. We're going to see exactly how a nation laid a simple foundation, built a standardized framework, expanded it into this massive superstructure, and is now future-proofing the whole shebang for the age of artificial intelligence. It's an incredible story of survival, adaptation, and just massive economic ambition.
But before we really look at the timeline, I want to ask you a question. Is TVET a second choice? For a really long time, there's been this completely outdated myth that vocational training is just a backup plan. You know, for students who maybe don't thrive in a traditional academic setting. It was viewed as the alternative route. Well, today, I want you to completely reconsider what you think you know. Because as we track the data and the history over the next few minutes, you're going to see that this so-called backup plan is actually the absolute primary engine driving modern economic growth.
Okay, let's dive into this and define exactly what we mean when we talk about TVET. It is a specialized education and training process designed to produce highly skilled professionals. But notice the specific breakdown here. TVET mandates that 50 to 70% of the curriculum is purely practical. It is heavily focused on psychomotor skills, hands-on industry exposure, and strict alignment with real industry standards. So you aren't just sitting in a lecture hall reading about how an engine works or how a network is built. No, you are getting your hands dirty and actually building it, preparing directly for the real-world job market.
Right, so here is our master blueprint for today. We're going to cover 5 chronological phases. The colonial foundation, standardizing the system, the higher education transformation, modernization towards revolution, and finally, the future vision.
Let's kick things off with Phase 1, the colonial foundation, where they were really just laying the groundwork.
So, back in the early 1900s, the British colonial government had a very specific problem. They were expanding tin mining and railways, and they desperately needed manual labor. Tracing this early timeline, back in 1906, training was strictly limited to basic skills. We're talking carpentry, metalwork, machine maintenance. It really wasn't formal education yet. But by 1926, we see a major leap. The very first technical school opens in Kuala Lumpur, offering systematic training in basic engineering and technical drawing. Fast forward to the 1930s, and this expands to places like Ipoh for mining, Johor for agriculture, and by 1932, Penang to support its booming trade port. But then disaster strikes. In 1941, the Japanese occupation during World War II completely halts the system. Infrastructure is ruined, and skilled workers are exploited for the war effort. It isn't until 1946, after the war, that the British military administration urgently rebuilds the system, transforming these ruined facilities into structured secondary trade schools just to help rebuild a war-torn nation.
Let's move to Phase 2 and see how this builds into the post-independence era, standardizing the system and building the framework.
After Malaysia gained independence, basic trade schools just weren't going to cut it for industrialization. They needed a real framework. This era is all about creating official national standards. In 1965, the government establishes secondary vocational schools, or SMVs, cementing vocational training into the formal education system. Then, in 1971, to meet the massive demands of a rapidly industrializing economy, the National Industrial Training and Trade Certification Board is born. But the absolute crowning achievement of this era happens in 1975. The National Institute of Technology, which actually traces its roots all the way back to that 1926 KL Tech School, gets a monumental upgrade. It is officially elevated to full university status, becoming University Technology Malaysia, or UTM. A year later, in 1976, the National Trade Skills Standards are introduced, meaning skills are finally being evaluated against formal, measurable industry benchmarks.
Moving right along into Phase 3, higher education transformation. This is where we see massive expansion.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how far the system had evolved. The 90s and 2000s marked a period of explosive growth, where TVET boldly entered higher education. Just look at the contrast. In 1946, we had the humble secondary trade school, designed purely to churn out basic, semi-skilled manual labor to rebuild after a war. Fast forward to the year 2000, and the nation is literally establishing entire technical universities dedicated to granting professional, high-level engineering and technology degrees. The entire paradigm had completely shifted.
The timeline of this expansion is honestly packed. In 1993, the NOSS system, the National Occupational Skills Standard, is introduced, focusing heavily on actual job-based competencies. By 1995, 69 vocational schools get upgraded to technical schools. Then, during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, retraining becomes absolutely vital. This leads Malaysia to study Germany's world-renowned dual vocational system. That directly influences the 2004 launch of the National Dual Training System, which perfectly blends classroom theory with real-world industry apprenticeships. Also, by 2001, community colleges opened their doors, democratizing lifelong learning for local communities everywhere.
Which brings us to Phase 4, modernization towards revolution. It's all about future-proofing.
By 2010, the target to become a high-income nation meant future-proofing talent for Industry 4.0, and this decade really pushed the boundaries of what TVET could be. In 2011, flexible single-skill certifications were introduced. In 2012, vocational colleges were launched, allowing students to earn actual diplomas rather than just high school certificates. But I really want to highlight 2015. The government passed the MBOT Act. This was a total game-changer. It created the Malaysia Board of Technologists and finally granted prestigious professional titles like Professional Technologist and Certified Technician to TVET graduates, giving them the societal and professional respect they truly deserved. Later, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the system proved its resilience. They quickly pivoted to emergency remote training, using digital platforms and virtual simulations to keep practical learning alive when physical workshops were forced to close.
Emerging from the pandemic in 2022, the TVET ecosystem had matured into a highly coordinated machine managed by, well, a bit of a modern alphabet soup of agencies. You have the Ministry of Human Resources coordinating everything, the Department of Skills Development handling certification, and the Manpower Department driving institutional growth. But most impressively, Malaysia partnered with OFQUAL, the UK's regulatory body. This ensured that Malaysian TVET qualifications are now recognized and respected on a global, international standard.
And that brings us to the present. Phase 5. The future vision, architecting the future. The foundation is laid, the framework is solid, and the expansion is global. So where is this blueprint heading next? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the paradigm shift. Think back to where we started in 1906, basic carpentry and metalwork, right? Now look at the focus areas for modern TVET, artificial intelligence, green energy, high-end semiconductor manufacturing, and advanced industrial automation. TVET is no longer just about maintaining machinery, it is about programming the literal robots that build the machinery.
To achieve this, the government is executing a rapid 3-year policy rollout. In 2024, they launched the National TVET Policy 2030, a long-term plan to make skills training the main educational choice. By 2025, they are completely consolidating the entire national TVET ecosystem under one streamlined, industry-focused umbrella. And by 2026, the massive 10-year National Education Plan begins, which legally binds industry integration directly into the classroom. They are locking in a decade of advanced, high-tech workforce development.
Which brings us to the core takeaway of our timeline today. If you translate the conclusion of the source material, it states perfectly clearly, TVET in Malaysia is no longer considered a second choice, but rather the primary trigger for the national economy. Over 120 years, it has transformed from a colonial necessity for basic labor into a high-tech incubator that determines whether the nation can actually compete on the global stage.
So the crucial point is this. The blueprint of the national workforce has been entirely redrawn. We are moving headfirst into an era of AI, green tech, and advanced automation. Whether you are a student, a mid-career professional, or an industry leader, the landscape is shifting rapidly beneath your feet. So, how are you preparing your own skills for the AI and automation-driven landscape of 2026 and beyond? Are you actively future-proofing your own blueprint? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep building those skills, and I'll see you next time.